in each of these, it's really about reflection and an opportunity to dive deeper and do the walk within. And here, what's being asked is a request of radical honesty with the self about where you're at in this process, where you'd like to be, and honestly, the commitment that you're willing to make to that. And you're the only person that can answer that. But to do that, you have to be as honest with yourself as you can, because this work will only go as deep as you choose for it to go. So right now, just like last week, we are having a word cloud as a way for folks to kind of immerse themselves in thinking about some of the things that we'll be kind of engaging with today. And this question for this week is, what words come to mind when you think of white privilege? You can either hit pollev.com/Carlso378, which is there up on the screen. Jenny's been kind enough to volunteer to drop into the already up site that she has, if you want to just drop the words into the chat there, so they can populate and you guys can see what other folks are thinking as well, but anonymously.
Wow. Discomfort. And so we'll give everybody about 30 more seconds to get.
Yeah, wow. So as you recall, as the word cloud kind of compiles word upon word upon word, the words that show up the most typically get larger. And so what I'm seeing is unseen, false, power, insidious,
complacency, bullshit.
Fair. Awesome. This is great. So as this is kind of populating, I'll just take a little quick minute to introduce myself. I feel like the folks that are on the call are kind of the steady eddies that have been on the call since the start. So welcome, I'm Verushka, this is Alicia. I, for my part, am doing this because I believe that in order for humanity to move forward into the future, we have to do it together, but we also kind of have to right the wrongs of the past, and the only way to do that is to be in conversation with one another. So where these conversations are happening here, I want them to be happening in other places as well. So I'm stoked to be here and be in conversation with you guys.
Yeah, and just, a reminder that, like, this is my work too, right? Like, all of this anti-racist work that, I'm doing with you, I'm actually doing with you, and I'm still on the journey of doing and being and striving to be, right? And so I just, as always, want to appreciate you for being here with me and, like, helping me through this just as much as I hope that you're getting something from this from me. And I'm just, like, in awe of what we're seeing on the word cloud come up, this brittle, shallowed acknowledgement, unacceptable. These are really powerful words. And so I really appreciate everything that's coming up. We're going to move forward. I can figure it out. This is always a little strange for me. And let's just take a breath. And we're not adding anything new today, but let's just start with whatever we need to start with. So inhale, exhale, figure out how your breath is right now, and see if you can move to this smooth, slow, even breath. Scanning your body. Noticing if there are any places that you need to either bring attention to or see if you can release, relax, maybe if your shoulders are in your ears. Getting settled in. And then just allow those thoughts to float on in, let that butterfly land. Maybe pause the bubble in animation. So you can take a second to kind of decide, to kind of label the root, like looking at this, considering, is this a love thought or a fear thought? And then noticing, is this in the vibe, in the direction of bringing us towards wholeness with each other, or supporting yourself as this one individual. And if it's towards that, protecting that individual, how can you change? What do you need to support that change towards love, towards wholeness, towards accepting that we're in this together, and stripping away whatever society has put on us? Let's take one big inhale together. Exhale. And then let's start the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. So in the same way that Alicia has always prepares our bodies to kind of arrive at a homeostasis, a calibration of kind of where we're at before we engage in this, we also want to offer up, again, community agreements that become more and more layered as the conversation becomes more nuanced and complex. And so as always, stay engaged, stay present, be here with us now. These conversations inevitably will become uncomfortable. And in the course of that discomfort is really where there's opportunity for healing and growth. Experience that discomfort, taking the time to recognize where, as Alicia's offered, where's the root of it? Where does it sit? Does it sit in the chest? Does it sit in the gut? And what feelings come up with that? And if you can face those, you're better positioned to speak your truth. And what's invited here is more, again, in each of these, it's really about reflection and an opportunity to dive deeper and do the walk within. And here, what's being asked is a request of radical honesty with the self about where you're at in this process, where you'd like to be, and honestly, the commitment that you're willing to make to that. And you're the only person that can answer that. But to do that, you have to be as honest with yourself as you can, because this work will only go as deep as you choose for it to go. This is the new one. We can't be expect and accept non-closure. So we've talked about this a lot, about this is definitely a journey and there is no destination, and that in that recognition, one needs to be open to curiosity, to self-reflection, and recognizing that you're not always going to get it right and that it's an ongoing process. This new one speaks to that as well, that we can't be articulate all the time. So we've been in conversation for 4 weeks. We've introduced, I don't know how new a vocabulary, but hopefully new vocabulary or a refresher course on the vocabulary you might have heard out in the ether. And then it's really unreasonable to expect you to be able to pivot and have some nuanced, thoughtful critique that somehow touches on class, race, gender, and somehow not miss the mark. So be compassionate with yourself that, like, we're not going to be able to get it right every single time. And to that extent, own your intention and impact. If you know that you're in process and that you're not going to get it right and you will stumble and fumble, own the intention of putting yourself out there, but be responsible for the impact as well. And care for yourself. This is not an opportunity to beat oneself up. This is not an opportunity to become a martyr. So if you need to stay grounded, and I tell you guys, I share this all the time, that holding on to this keeps me here, trying to keep me focused and like not talking too fast. And if you have something comparable that you need, grab it.
A blanket.
Your blanket. Stay hydrated. When you see, you might hear negative self-talk, just gently kind of pivot away from that. Take care of you in this, and embrace joy and laughter. It is all happening. All of the isms and all of the ugly parts of the world are absolutely happening, but there's also whimsy and joy and beauty and mirth, and we can be in conversation with those things as well if we do those other community agreements. So thank you guys, and take care. We'll see you in a bit. Take care. Jesus.
Listen, we're not getting out of here yet. So just a reminder of where we've been and where we are, hopefully, and what today's kind of purpose is. The first week we just kind of looked at these like internal things that happen, development, the diversity circles, and how those circles kind of radiate within us, but also how they cause us to kind of interact with other people. Then we talked about the body and how the body reinforces racism in the kind of split-second decisions in those deep nervous system areas. Last week we took a look at systems and the cycle of socialization, and then this week, oh goodness, it's a day. And then today we're going to kind of look at the looks and sounds of anti-racism. Just know that this is also kind of like last week going to be another big one. And so really take into consideration how you're going to have some self-care, how you plan on being radically honest with yourself, and let's do it. I love this book. You want to read it?
Yeah, absolutely. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including yourself. It's the only way forward. And this is from the author of So You Want to Talk About Racism, Ijeoma Oluo. And for me, I think that this quote resonated even before I had heard it. I had heard Ibrahim Kendi X, I think is the gentleman's name.
Ibrahim X Kendi.
Do an interview on NPR where he effectively said, people think of racism as something like a noun, person, place, or thing that you can point to over there, as opposed to an adjective that describes behavior and habits or patterns that are ostensibly changeable. And I feel like this quote absolutely speaks to that this anti-racism, precisely because it's so immersive and so immersed in all of our systems and the ways that we get socialized, it's inescapable. So you don't have to say that like, I'm completely not racist. That's not, it's not existing in, that's the ideal. That's wanting to exist in the ideal. And we're talking about the real. But really what anti-racism is about is a commitment to action in the daily, the same way that we commit to our daily movement practice. This is no different, but it's asking us to be mindful in both body and spirit.
Yeah, and I think for me, this quote really talks about vulnerability. It doesn't exactly say it, but when I think of my anti-racist journey, I've had to be vulnerable in ways that are so uncomfortable. They're so uncomfortable, and I even just thinking about it, you saw my body kind of respond, because I think of all the moments where I've had to either, when you talk about fighting it in yourself, or wherever you find it. So it also means being able to have those conversations with other people, or admit I did this thing that was really hurtful or really harmful, and you're that is not I felt that's not who I wanted to be. But it also means that I have to acknowledge, accept it, and hold the the little thing in front of me and be that's it. And so that commitment to being able to see and be vulnerable and be in pain sometimes, it really kind of was whew,
it's a lot.
Yeah. So thinking about all of that, we're going to take another breath. We're going to just let that settle in for you. And we'll just take a few moments just to breathe and scan and sit with any thoughts that maybe came up for you, or that showed up in your body, considering the roots of love and fear, and if this is moving you towards oneness or wholeness, individuality or community. And considering any change, any support for change that might need to happen in order to lean towards love in the whole. I see this image of a plant reaching towards the sun. It turns away from the sun, but it always slowly finds its way back. And taking one big breath, coming back together. Exhaling out. And then let's get going on to the next thing. Whew.
The Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. You want to talk about a little bit?
I just want you to take any calm any strength, and just be here for this moment.
Cool. And I think part of the reason why I think Alicia is being super vigilant about making sure you breathe and like, hey, are you taking care of yourself, is because when one begins to finally describe white privilege, it feels like a newly discovered or a new sensation of accountability that can be overwhelming, infuriating, inspire resentment, all manner of feelings. I'm not presuming to kind of name or claim any of them, but just putting them out there as possible realities. And this, I feel like the metaphor of invisibility keeps coming up in terms of an invisible knapsack. In the previous session, we talked about oppression is kind of the fascia, this invisible, mechanism that, moves the system or the cycle of socialization. And here, when invisibility comes up, or the concept of invisibility as it relates to privilege, it gets captured as a knapsack, as this thing that you carry around with you and you don't even think about, and it's not visible until somebody by happenstance asks you, hey, I didn't know I needed to bring a knapsack to, this party. And they're like, oh, no, everybody's got one, when in fact, that's not the case, right? So the exercise that we're going to do is always, I want to tie this to something experiential, but what makes this exercise especially interesting is that the woman, Peggy McIntosh, this experiment is born of her own experience. I kid you not, when you watch the video of her, she's like straight out of casting for Strawberry Shortcake Village librarian, right? Glasses, erudite, intellectual, very, very classic. Like I said, straight out of casting. And she was talking about how in the early 80s, she had read a Black feminist essay that effectively said working with white women was an oppressive experience, where that by virtue of working alongside white women, that they maintained or propped up the mechanisms of white supremacy, sexism, etc. And she was agog. She took umbrage.
As a white woman, she was like, I'm a good white woman. Yeah,
exactly. Absolutely. She was like, when I work with, my colleagues, I try to work even harder to be more present and thoughtful, et cetera, et cetera. And she, this is her phrase, that she prayed on it, and that she asked her unconsciousness to bubble up for her, to raise up for her where these oppressions show up in daily life. And she said that she had a dream, and she shot up in the middle of the night, and that she had 45 off the bat, and that rather than go back to sleep and be like, I'm going to write them down in the morning, recognizing how ephemeral the unconscious answers can be when they reveal themselves, she wrote it down right then.
I feel like she meditated on it, and it like showed up.
Right. Now, just to be clear, and she says this as well, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are not 50 things that you can identify and be like, aha, I've checked off these 50 things. But what she was ultimately trying to point out is the need for self-reflection, to be able to do the walk within, to figure that out for yourself, but also recognize that it's, as offered previously, immersive.
So we've only gotten, I think there's 7 or 8, I forget the exact number, but we've pulled a few out for us to kind of work through. Yeah? How do you want to do this?
So the way, if you've got notebook in hand, or the workbook that we sent via email and PDF, you can go ahead and take that out. Now, as always, we've asked you to locate yourselves in this experience called life. Where do you land, in your community, or where you teach? What's that dominant cultural group for this community, right? And thinking about who else might be around that might be a non-dominant cultural group, but focus on your dominant cultural group in that community.
So it could be like yoga, your job, the yoga studio, your friends, even your family. Right? Could be any of those kind of places.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
So what you're going to do is just answer in the affirmative or in the negative if, in fact, this would fit into your world, like it could happen. So the scenarios are as follows. I feel welcomed and normal in the usual walks of public life, both institutional and social.
It's like when you go into your yoga studio, do you feel normal? When you go into your job, do you feel like you're normal in some way, shape, or form? You might not like fit all the buckets, because when we talk about those rings of diversity, but there is a normalcy to you being in that space.
I can take a job with an affirmative action employer without having my coworkers on the job suspect that I got it because of my race. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time.
So when I go to the supermarket, when I go to my job, when I go anywhere, I can basically be around people who look and sound like me.
I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race.
This one for me, like, just struck home as far as thinking about my high schoolers and the kind of historical information they're given or the people that they're asked to read, and does it reflect their race, right?
If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live.
So I'm not forced into an area because I can only afford that one area, but like I can afford that area and I want to live there.
I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. My culture gives me little fear about ignoring the perspectives and powers of people and other races.
So can you explain this one a little bit?
My culture gives me little fear about ignoring the perspectives and powers of people of other races, which is to say that I've been so immersed in the world that I grew up in that it might even be a polite ignorance, but never even thought to think about what you were thinking about or if you were concerned. It was just kind of a
this is my way of thinking.
It was just kind of like a monolithic understanding of your world because I'm so immersed right here. I am not made acutely aware that my shape, bearing, or body odor will be taken as a reflection on my race. So those were the scenarios offered. And the question I would, put to you guys that you can kind of just take a moment to thoughtfully respond to and say like 3 minutes, 2 minutes, or 3 minutes.
I mean, I think 30 seconds has been, I feel like 3 minutes is too much. 30 seconds.
What challenged, changed, or confirmed your understanding of privilege?
So challenge, right? Because you talked about white privilege in the beginning, in the cloud formation. Right. So how does this either, challenge, change, or confirm what you had thought, or even if there were other things that came up?
Cool. I hope you had a moment. So, because Alicia has been mouth breathing over here next to me, I'd like to know what you were thinking. Like, what challenged or confirmed or changed
the one
your
that like really stuck out for me was the one about like if I live in a place, like people are going to be nice to me. Because recently in the I think it's like the Long Island Patch or something. I don't know. It's something. There's this story of this woman in Valley Stream. I think she's like a nurse and a mother, and she's talking about how she's being harassed in her neighborhood, and the police are like, there's nothing we can do. But to me, it's just like, I remember my like Puerto Rican grandmother having like the same thing happen to her in like the 50s, and it was like, oh, that's real. It was like a moment of like, oh, like a thing I didn't even think about, even though I had seen this story of this woman who, regardless of like what's actually happening, like she feels like there's all of this happening around her. And so like that experience of like believing people when they say what they're saying, like it just kind of hit me over the head as like, not so distant, not so far from like my own life.
Yeah, no, I think the thing that stood out for me was the question around the perception of your bearing, your weight, or your odor being like a reflection of your race. And I think that that's something that absolutely hit home for a whole host of reasons. But if I think about it outside of my immediate self, and I think about my friends that are doing activism work in fat positivity, or body positivity, excuse me, but explicitly wanting people to be like, no, I'm fat, and like, let's not, use other words around it. Or thinking about the work that's being done in the disability activism, I felt like that's where I was challenged about, like, okay, Verushka, you do have absolutely made assumptions about people based on those things that you didn't necessarily ascribe to race, but you absolutely ascribe to some other marginalized identity. Um, and that I needed to like check that.
So even and this is a thing that's been duplicated, this kind of like list, and we have this list in the resources in the handout, in the handbook or whatever. But this is definitely something that like has been iterated on in all sorts of areas of privilege. And so, while we're specifically talking about white privilege, I think what V is bringing up is that like this is not the only thing, right? Because when we talk about intersectionality, like the overlapping of things, like they're it's all there. It's all of them. So even though like we are talking specifically about white privilege and being anti-racist, that these things just they overlap, and there's no way to not have them overlap, because we are dynamic, complex beings.
Absolutely, and interconnected.
Yeah. All right. So take all of those thoughts and all of those experiences in your body, and let's just breathe for a second. See if you can get yourself to that slow, long, even breath. Identifying areas in your body that might need a little extra attention. And then allow any thoughts to come back, to come up, or to be. Really allowing them to stay with you for a few moments. The seed of that. Is it love or fear? Are you trying to protect the individuality of the self? Or are you identifying the self as the whole? And if this is a seed of fear, or you're moving towards the self as an individual, how can you change or support the change towards love and wholeness? And take a breath together. Inhale. Exhale. Maybe shrug your shoulders, feel the knapsack for a second, and then just let it go. So last week we talked about this cycle. It's a big circle. It's in your handbooks. And we talked about what happens when you continue this cycle of socialization, right? The cycle of socialization are all of the layers in society that reinforce white supremacy, that reinforce, our white privilege. And we talked about like, what does it look like when we continue and layer, right? But today we're talking about this direction of change. And we're talking about interrupting the cycle in a way that is meaningful and powerful. And one of the things that we talked about is like, basically we need an action plan. We need steps to think about, to consider as a way to move forward, because this work does not end here. And United We Own has a whole bunch of stuff that we're planning moving forward, that the board is talking about, that we're in communion with, all of the members and, whomever with. But for you personally, what is this going to look like? And so before we even get into that action plan, we wanted to talk about some kind of do's and don'ts, okay? Because this is like, we're trying to remove as many stumbling blocks that I've personally gone through, so you're at least aware of them, right? And it may happen. I still have these, I still, don't listen to the experience of BIPOC people sometimes. I still, there's still things that I even do that I have to learn to undo. But the idea here is that by telling you what we know, that you may be able to kind of inform your own experiences as you move through this work. So thinking about this and then moving into your kind of like action plan.
Yeah, and I guess like, look, this is not a cautionary tale, just to be clear, okay? Like it's literally just some information so that you're not, if you don't want to be unintentionally ignorant, you go out and seek information, and this is that moment.
Yeah,
So,
and I think, this really is rooted in that like ahimsa, right? In this like non-harming piece, because really the work of anti-racism is the work not harming, right? It's the work of doing our best to honor and protect the lives around us. Okay,
so when we titled this particular piece "Unpacking the Backpack" because we wanted to thread the needle between like, okay, so you did that tally, you have a sense of what's in the backpack now, perhaps, and you're like, I don't want the backpack, I don't need the backpack, but the backpack's here. What now? And I clearly, on that cycle, I don't necessarily want to be the person that continues the status quo. I don't want to be the person who's silent. But I'm certainly not ready to, be on the front lines or take, to take that step. And I'm trying to figure out what that looks like and feels like. No problem. Welcome to where you are, right? Here, we want to talk about basically as Alicia offered, the minefields. So the don'ts. We'll start with the things not to do first. Don't appoint allyship. And what ultimately, and just to be clear, ally is a word that is in contention right now in certain circles about.
We've had lots of big conversations about
whether or not that's the appropriate word to use, because if you look at the technical definition, it is basically
historical definition.
The two entities sharing resources for to further a mutual aim. And to a certain extent, that is certainly the case. But what doesn't get spoken about, and I think that's where folks take issue, is the power dynamic piece. And this actually speaks to why you shouldn't appoint yourself as being like, I'm these folks' ally. It means that you haven't taken the time to listen or ask if they want that allyship or what it needs to look like. But it also presumes that you know more or you've got expertise, when in fact that isn't the case, right? So good intention, but the impact lands in a different way. So just be vigilant about that.
And I've heard people talk about this idea of like aspiring ally, right? And I think one of the things that we're talking about here is like unlearning labels, right? Because applying the label of allyship to yourself is almost like optical, right? You're almost like doing it to be seen sometimes. And so that is an area where you're like, is that for me? Am I doing this for me as my individual Alicia body? As one of our members says, my individual Alicia meat sack? Or am I doing this for the wholeness of my community that I'm in part of and of? So that's just my limit.
No, 1,000%. Because again, I don't have that perspective, right? Like I can be an ally in different arenas, and I know that what that journey's been like, but this isn't my specific journey. So if you feel compelled to speak to it, by all means. And part of the reason why we'd say that don't appoint, allyship. Sure, we just offered like the kind of the optical stuff, but I'd also say, what about, again, you, the individual? What happens when you get burnt out? Or you overcommit yourself? Or you push yourself past your boundaries more than you're comfortable because you're trying so hard to live up to this label that you gave yourself? That doesn't mean don't hesitate to interrupt racism or oppression where you see it. It means don't put the undue Daryl. Sorry.
We have a kitten that's really happy to be with us. Sorry, I don't know. Is the screen still okay, Jenny? Yeah, okay, cool.
All right. So anyway, because when you do that, you know what? I'm just gonna take a breath. Hold on a second. Damn it, Daryl, and that's exactly why I named him Daryl, because he does stuff like that. Okay, so the reason why we caution against, or anybody that's doing this work would caution against appointing yourself about allyship, sure, there's the power piece. But it's also about self-care, which we talked about at the start as one of the community agreements that you have with yourself. Overcommitting, overextending yourself, emotionally putting yourself out there when you're not ready, and then it blows up in your face, and then you have a naturally negative response where you're like, ouch, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm not.
Pause.
And you pause. What you're looking for are sustainable ways to be able to maintain this work because you've committed to that you've accepted that non-closure piece.
Right.
You know
And
what I
this
mean?
is, I think a part of this is also doing yourself no harm, right? It's like not harming yourself, right? Because you can't be in service of others if you're not a whole being in yourself first, right? Like you have to be really aware of yourself. And part of that is that studying of like, how do I feel? You know, that whole self-study stuff, right? Like that, like, okay, right now and I know we use these terms in all sorts of different ways, but just thinking about it as like, how do I find myself in order to be a part of the larger being?
The other is participating in call out culture. And like, look, yes, cancel culture, call out culture, calling in, calling out. We've all heard that the fodder out there. And I appreciate the youngins for introducing that, new lingo to my life, but it isn't always productive. And if you yourself, or take me, I'm recognizing that I'm on a journey of learning my own privilege around gender, or learning my own privilege around being in the body being okay with the body that was assigned to me at birth. I can't go then to other people who are just beginning the journey or are also on the journey and call them out and expect bridges not to be burned, fights not to happen, people telling you to go get bent. Like those things will all absolutely take place because you're using the truth like a blunt object, when in fact the opportunity is for more self-reflection and to identify other folks that are also on that journey. But again, not using the truth like a blunt weapon, but finding more helpful ways and more powerful ways to be able to like do this work.
Yeah, and that's the balance between like I'm being truthful, but I'm also not harming, right? I'm being honest with this relationship, but I'm also not trying to like make someone feel bad. And if we're really talking about sustainable change, what I've noticed in my own conversations, in my own work with other white people, like you have to be connected deeply to someone in order to shift deep-rooted experiences of life. And if all of a sudden someone is upset or mad or angry, you're not having a productive conversation with that person.
So don't ask BIPOC folks to do your work. And you've seen a lot of memes where people are just like, Google it. And there is definitely that spectrum of attitude for sure. But really it's about bandwidth. So if you're recognizing in the course of this work, there is systemic, interpersonal, and inner work that is simultaneously need to be done by you, society, and that there are daily, minute by minute, folks that are suffering the injustices of this, don't ask them to go put all of that on display because you are trying to understand. There are intellectuals who've put out bodies of work. There are artists who have put out beautiful pieces of music, literature, film, poetry, jazz, etc., that you can go and engage to have a better understanding of this experience than to just arrive with your invisible knapsack and be like, help.
And I think the other part to this too is this idea of like, if we're having a conversation about race, I have to be careful that I'm not assuming things. Mm-hmm. Like when we go into conversations about race and white privilege, I ask, hey babe, how you feeling right now? Because I would love to talk about this thing that just happened and it's about this racist person. Do you have like the capacity right now?
Right.
And because in that way, I'm trying to avoid doing more harm, right? You're not going to go up to someone who has some sort of trauma and talk about the thing that caused their trauma in a moment where they're not capable to kind of work with that. You don't want to traumatize somebody. It's real.
All right, so now let's talk about the do's, right? Yeah, no, I know. I already peeped that. So stay humble in terms of the things that you should do. Humility is huge in exercising your privilege on somebody else's behalf, because it means that even though you're tempted to act because you recognize you have the privilege and you're in a position to do something, check in with the folks that you want to be in solidarity with and see precisely what that need needs to look like, and then take their lead from there. Apologize when you get it wrong, which we touched about again on the community agreements. Nobody's always going to get it right, Nobody is born fully formed from Zeus's head, perfect.
Nor are you ever going to apologize correctly.
Right. But I think authenticity goes a long way in taking ownership immediately as opposed to hemming and hawing. That I know that personally drives me nuts. Be a good listener. This is actually very hard. Like this isn't just like hard because we're talking about racism. Like literally, it's just hard for human beings to listen to other human beings. So to that extent that you're able, practice being a good listener. And what I mean by that is don't listen to respond, listen to understand. And what that means is that when somebody's actually speaking to you, let them finish completely. Even if there's like silence at the end and they're like, but do you have anything to say? And you're like, no, I just wanted you to know that I was listening to you. And then synthesize what you heard. That's really the hallmarks of a good listener.
And we already talked about this next piece.
Right. And then just being willing to step up and step back. And I think that, Alicia will talk about that in the action plan piece about what this can look like, because we wanted to, as you see in the workbook, when we had those community agreements, there's actually a dialogue of what it can look like and sound like. We wanted to give some other actionable kind of mid-level things to think about. And now Alicia, as is her wont, and she loves a plan and an Excel spreadsheet, is going to give you guys an action plan about what this can look like.
We missed the last one because we had our thing over it, whatever the bar is at the bottom,
Mm-hmm.
but like believing Black, Indigenous people of color when they tell you something.
I've definitely lost a friendship behind that one. I had a hoity-toity nonprofit gig, went to Mayor Bloomberg's private house. Somebody handed me their plate as if I was the help. And I was telling that to my friends afterwards, and they blew me off. Like, oh, no, that didn't happen. Like, you're kidding. You're like, look, you were even there. Like, the whole point that you were even there is proof that, like, all is forgiven. And that kind of, it didn't happen overnight, but that ended that friendship, So it's real. Believe people.
Yeah. And so here's the action plan. And it's just about going beyond that surface. So going back to that tree. That was a big kind of moment.
Can we
breathe real quick? I'd really like to just take one breath together, because I feel like what we shared in the do's and don'ts was a lot. And I know that we're a little strapped for time, but let's breathe. So if everybody could just take 3 deep breaths, slow, smooth, calm, whatever that looks like for you right now. I'm not going to time it out, but just take 10 more seconds. And then exhale on your last breath. Let's transition into this kind of last piece.
Mm-hmm. And what do you mean by going beyond anti-surface racism?
Surface anti-racism.
Yes.
So when we were talking about that culture tree, right? I know we've got a lot of diagrams to think back to, but think back to the tree and the leaves and the things that were on there: clothes, food, whatever the things that you can point at. And so when I talk about surface anti-racism, that's what I'm talking about. We need to figure out how to go beyond just the things we can point at, say I did, said I do, check, check, check. Here's my sticker for allyship. And figure out, like, what are the deep things that I can do moving forward in order to really make this work. And so first, just consider, going back to that invisible knapsack piece, consider a place where you feel normal, a space that you walk into, you're like, I'm normal there. Very often, for us, it's a yoga place. If you are a business owner, you may want to think about, or if you teach in a yoga space, you may want to think about the yoga space for this experience. And just considering where is a place where you feel normal, because that sense of normalcy is actually your power, right? It's not, we know that there is no normal. So if you go into a place and you feel normal, what does that say about that experience, right? So the first step that I would love to encourage is this idea of learning. In the handbook, there's this like super extensive resource section. It's not all inclusive, but it's the idea that, you have to learn about your privilege and positionality, historical and contemporary struggles, in order to see and dismantle the system. And so I love the example that one of my friends brought up about, they used grandfathered in, and they were thinking about it, and they're like, well, maybe that feels something about that doesn't feel right. And they were able to work through a process, and they Googled it, and they found out that it did have historical implications back to Jim Crow and the civil rights and the Civil War. And so what we're just inviting you to do is to, just like you did in school and you found the history of the European world, the colonized world, we're asking you to do the same for those, for Black
Other
people
cultures,
as well, for other people, and not this monolithic Black people. But so thinking about a TED Talk, a discussion group, something that you can commit to for your self-study in order to be deeper around the truth that is society, that are those layers that are put upon us. And so some of the things that, I personally thought were great are the Layla Saad book, Me and White Supremacy. We just happened upon a book called Racial Healing Workbook that's really great. Skill in Action. These are some workbooks that you can do, but there's also, reading lists and videos and movies. And so even though we're not going to have a ton of time right now, that's something you can totally go back to and, pick through and see what really works for you. But this idea that you have to commit yourself to learning, listening. And this goes back to what Bea was talking about believing experience. This goes back to, deeply seeing someone, right? This idea of like namaste, like I see you deeply. And can you really deeply see and acknowledge someone if you don't actually know what they're saying and you don't actually pause for that breath? And so I invite you first to consider what location, where is the place where you can start to listen? And so for me, I thought about like my job, thinking about in the yoga communities and in yoga schools, where is this place that you can kind of go to listen to people, right? And then who? So think of names of people, right? Think of, how can you give people their time? You don't want to, the non-stealing, right? You don't want to take away their experience, and you do that by deeply listening. And if you're like, I don't know where I can listen, I don't know where I can be, go back to the rings of diversity. Think about your work. Think about, all of the places within your cultural development and socialization where you can just kind of like, I can name at least 4 people at my day job that I'm like, I need to listen better. And I know their names, and I have to make that commitment, because that's a part of that, that honesty and that truthfulness, and that, that ahimsa and all of those things that overlap and make up this, as Jenny likes to say, how we play in the sandbox of the world. Now, this one is maybe the hardest one for me. So it's about not being the voice of the conversation. It's about trusting those who have been minoritized, marginalized, following their lead, and avoiding centering. Centering is when we make ourselves the focus of a conversation that is not about white people. It's when I feel bad and I verbalize that and I change the whole direction of the conversation from, I'm sorry I, said that racist thing, to now I feel bad, I'm crying, I'm emotive. And, even thinking about where is your, if you're on this call and you do yoga, right? Where is your center for wanting that anti-racist work to happen, right? Are you coming from this individual Alicia body? Or are you coming from, how do I really connect in and become and acknowledge, be that whole, that community? And so just, do you have anything on centering you wanted to bring up?
It's definitely a don't.
Yeah. And it's also this step back to step up. And this is hard financially, right? So who can
really
you
what
support?
You're talking about, what you're talking about, I think, is power. Is it
Mhm.
that what yielding is about is a recognition that you're giving up power? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And power can be my the who is listening to my voice. It can be the job that I have. It can be the money that I make, right? There's an example, I forget where I read it, but this idea of like, before you take a raise, have you asked if people of color have been, were there people of color who interviewed for this job, and have you considered them for this position?
Right, which is a huge risk if you yourself are trying to get a job for whatever reason. Um, and I think that that's why, and correct, I don't want to presume your feelings about why this is so hard for you, but I think in general, the yielding piece of what it means to be an ally, and I don't know if you guys picked up on that, like the what we've been talking about typically, it actually spells out ally, but the yielding here is really about, if you recognize that race is a construct that's ultimately about power in a society, and the question then becomes, are you willing to give up some of that power? Are you willing to divest yourself of the myth of meritocracy? That's by, you very well might have worked your tail off to get where you're at because you have the strength in you, but also recognize that there was unearned advantage that also played a part. And would you be willing to give up that unearned advantage? Or at a minimum, at least put it out and acknowledge it and call out the elephant in the room as a first step. And I think that that's really hard because power is incredibly hard to give up once you've had it or once you've had a taste, even if you don't intend to keep it or want to keep it.
Yeah, there's this non-hoarding existence in us, right? We should be releasing of things, right? And I think one of the things is, well, I have to take care of my family. Well, I earned it. Well, I have this. Well, I have that. Okay, so there's a lot of, and we could go on forever about this, and maybe in the Q&A we can talk about this more. But there's a lot of falsehoods in that kind of language, right? That's not like, when we talk about like right thinking and wrong thinking, like that's definitely not towards the right thinking area, because if we're honest with ourselves, there's more than enough resources and energy to go around. And so the fact that there's this disparity means somebody's hoarding something. And it's not just the top 1%, even though, no politics here, but thinking about this as like a whole. And so thinking about this in a yoga studio, who can you support in letting them lead the conversation, in allowing them to be the leader that you can follow, versus trying to be the one that people are following. And I think this is like, nobody asked you to do this, right? This is, we were talking about this in the action piece, and let's just talk about that for something, but identifying how you can take action, joining the conversation versus starting a new one, right? What areas are you drawn to, and what organizations can you support? Because there's something to be said about, like, and I think you said it this way, but like being invited into the conversation. You don't go somewhere, you don't go to someone's house and like, I'm going to clean your bathroom. You're like, but nobody asked you to clean my bathroom. I actually don't need you to clean my bathroom. If you want to do work, I would love it if you could fold my clothes. Like, which is real. That's a
very real example that you gave.
But so when you're going into an organization and saying, I want this to happen, but like, that might not need to happen. That might not be the agenda. That's you as yourself, individual self, trying to mold the community, mold the whole. And what we know is there is no holding of anything, right? And like, there's no truth in what you're trying to do. There's harm, possibly. Right? I just cleaned my bathroom yesterday. And not that that's like a direct correlation.
And that's not what I'm saying, but I thought it was actually an excellent example precisely because of that. Because you don't go over to people's houses being like, that's funny. I'm going to go clean your bathroom unceremoniously, unprompted. People take offense to that. They think that something's wrong, something's amiss. So being willing to ask those questions or join the conversation, and frankly, even doing something like this is proof of that proof of concept in terms of like that action piece. But now my challenge to y'all would be, go have a conversation with at least one person in your life that's super important, where you know that this is going to be this is going to be a real conversation, and see if you can employ some of the things you've learned, not to, again, use the truth as a blunt object or anything like that, but to practice. This is all practice.
And what is yoga but a practice of life? Or at least, one of my interpretations. So just take a few seconds here, and just, think about your definition of anti-racism now. And I'm going to give them to you together so you can figure out how you want to answer this, but also consider, how has it changed over the course of 4 weeks, if it's changed at all. The hope is that you have gotten something from this experience, and just to kind of like embed that in your mind of what that is and what that looks like at this moment. So we're going to give you another like 10 seconds because we want to be super mindful of time.
Nice.
And then we want to give you some next steps. Just in your mind, think about what you want your next step. Like, what do I want to be? What's the being, the essence of who I am as moving forward from this experience? What is the essence I want to embody? And of course, it's my hope that it's like embodying towards the whole and moving away from the individual, but And then we're going to do 2 things you can actually do. What are 2 next steps that like you can actually do? Is it finding a book? Is it finding an organization? Is it following up with United We Own to work with them on their next things? I know, Jen, just big ups, Jenny and Matt and the board, and we've all been in conversation about, this work doesn't stop here. Whether it's, a restorative kind of circle, or whether it's, a part 2 to this work, thinking about what your own next steps are, actionable, I can do this thing that's actually happening, and not just kind of an amalgam, like an amoeba, right? Amoeba type existence. So
nice.
Yeah.
So we want to be super respectful of folks' time. So we'll leave you with this. We want to leave you with this closing reflection, which I think that very much encapsulates the spirit of what ultimately is being asked here. And it's by a seminal thinker from the 70s named Bell Hooks. And in fact, she still teaches at CUNY, I believe. And the quote is, "What we do is more important than what we say or what we say we believe." And that could not be more truer for this kind of work. It's in the showing, and it's about how you show up on the regular, and know that it's not always going to be perfect, but you got to be committed to the doing.
Yeah.
So
I love this quote too, because it's like, it's simple, right? Like, this work doesn't have to be this kind of like academic, out there in the ether kind of work. It's the work that we do every day. It's the stuff that we are in existence. And so I appreciate all of you and all of the stuff and all of your existence. And I'm so thankful that there were people who are on this journey with me, and that you have given me space to grow and see me as I am now. So I really just wanted to say thank you, and I appreciate all of you, and like United We Own for supporting these efforts.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you to United We Own for inviting me into these kinds of conversations, and allowing me to like use these design experience skill sets to kind of hopefully authentically bring people into conversation about this work. And when I think about these last 4 weeks and like the work that we've put into it, I think the thing that I took from it in terms of doing of this work is that I really love talking about moving people through an experience, but not because it's Verushka, but because like that's exactly what life is. Like if I sit here and I say to myself, I'm going to say yes to life, I can't do that if I'm not willing to be authentic with myself, and certainly with the authentic with other folks. And so to give folks tools to engage with their own authenticity and then radiate that out to the world has been really awesome. So thank you guys.